Alright, guys, welcome back. Got another movie review to talk about, and today I just got done watching Moonfall. Now, when I first initially saw this trailer, it looked like one of those very interesting, very quirky, corny, potentially really bad disaster movies, which I'm all about. Um, I was I thoroughly enjoyed 2012, Armageddon. I'm that type of person who is 100% normie when it comes to disaster movies. And when I saw Moonfall, it's like, man, we haven't had a cheesy, popcorn eating type of movie when it comes to disaster films. And when I saw this, like, I need to go see this because this is my escapism that I really enjoy. You can call me a psychopath, but it's just one of those things that I just like to turn off my brain and actually watch, just the world get crumbled. So when it comes to Moonfall, let's just say it is definitely one of the more worst disaster movies. I would even argue that it is actually really mismanaged and misadvertised. And so I'm going to go a little bit spoiler free for right now, but I'll let you guys know when I will start going into spoilers and talk about what made this a really bad disaster movie, but a potentially good sci-fi story if it was on Netflix. So we're looking at Rotten Tomatoes here. So Moonfall, it is 38% on the tomato meter with the critics and the audience score of 69. So my overall thoughts, spoiler free. This movie was definitely mispaced. The writing was terrible. There was too many characters to flush out, and they tried to flush out all the characters in the first half of the movie between the first and second act. And it was a sludge to get through because me being the normie, I want the okay, when is destruction going to happen? Okay, where's the build up? The build up was really really long. I think as a disaster movie, you really have to do that build up fairly quickly so that way you can keep the audience engaged. And then usually by the second act, you got to be well into the action. And the action really didn't take place until late second half of the second act, almost the third act. And it really crammed everything in the third act and really like gave you a huge lore dump in the end. And that third act, there was a great sci-fi story just wanting to come out, wanting to be birthed upon you. And it just didn't, it fell flat because there was too much and you can really just dump it all by the end of the movie. And so, um, going through the first half, it was, oof, man, it was a slug to get through. There was too much human story versus the disaster slash um, sci-fi elements to this, and that's pretty much all I can say, spoiler free. Because I the third act is where I really want to talk about because it really lays down the evidence of why this should have been rebranded and this should have been for a Netflix TV show. And so, with that, I would give this a 3 out of 10. Would I recommend seeing this movie in theaters? Absolutely not. For the price I paid, because I paid about $10 because of California tax and everything, it's expensive. And basically, what you're getting is bad writing, terrible pacing, because it was rough for like the first hour, and I would say hour and 10 minutes. It was pretty drawn out, and the action scenes. The problem with the action scenes is that, sure, in a disaster movie, it can be unrealistic. And I think that's kind of the general expectation when you go into a disaster film is that, okay, there's going to be some level of unrealism. Moonfall definitely takes it to a whole new level when it comes to unrealistic. And I'm going to go into some of the nitpicks that I had with this in the spoiler section. And so, what I recommend you guys going out and spend your hard earned money on this movie? No, absolutely not. I recommend you watch this. If you're a fan of disaster films, I would highly recommend it still. Just keep in mind that it's definitely on the worst, definitely worst of the worst end scale when it comes to a disaster film because, again, it's not really a disaster film. It has a lot of carnage and destruction in it, but it's mismarketed. So yeah, I would highly recommend watching this like on Netflix or on some sort of streaming platform or renting it from Redbox. This is definitely one of those that if you got time to kill, rent it for $1, and I think you'll be somewhat entertained out of this. I would not recommend going to the movie theater. So with that, that's all I can say as far as the non-spoiler section. If you don't want to get spoiled, feel free to watch this video at a later time. But with that, you have been warned. We're going to go into the spoilers. All right, so when it comes to Moonfall, we basically follow three main characters. We got Casey Horseman, Joe Fowler, and Brian Harper. So at the beginning of this particular movie, we're basically introduced to space. We've got this astronaut crew, and they are basically attacked by this mysterious alien. And this alien essentially kills an astronaut. And so this pilot, Brian Harper, basically had to fly the shuttle unassisted with electronics back to Earth. Unfortunately, because of that one astronaut dying, now there was a whole cover up within the government to try to hide what actually happened. Go figure. It is, again, it's a disaster movie with cover ups. I mean, it happens. That's the typical trope that we see in disaster films. And so Joe Fowler then gets kind of blamed for human error for the astronaut dying, and now he's living on his own trying to rebuild himself. And then Casey Houseman, if I remember correctly, she is played by Halle Berry. And I tell you what, Halle Berry was gorgeous throughout this entire movie. It doesn't look like she's aged in a day. But are there wokeness in here? Yes, there is. There's a few little spots that there's a little bit of white man bad or white man cowardly. It's not necessarily white man bad. It's more of the typical, the white man quits, and then the strong female lead then kind of takes over and leads the show. But she wasn't, and this was Casey Horseman's character or Halle Berry's character, but it wasn't overdone. It was there, but then it was gone in a few minutes later. So there are little aspects of that and so forth. So we find out that there's a huge cover up, that the Apollo missions had discovered that what can I say? The Apollo mission discovered that there was this technology that they were discovering before, and it was a huge cover-up. Go figure. Again, it's another trope in disaster movies. And that's one thing about this movie is that there are a ton of tropes. Usually when it comes to disaster movies, there's usually one or two type of tropes, from the government covering things up to the government wants to nuke everything, which they wanted to nuke the moon, which is, again, it's whatever. But there's too many of them. It's like they combined all of the tropes from all the disaster movies in the past all into this show. So that was an issue that I had with the writing. And so, come to find out, there was an event that happened on the moon, and now the moon was basically out of orbit. And we have this particular character here. It was, oh no, I'm sorry. Halle Berry's character was played by Joe Fowler. Fowler is a character that Halle Berry was playing. This is Casey Horseman. Sorry, getting my characters. I'm terrible with names and characters. I do apologize. And so, Casey Horseman is one of those conspiracy theorists that the moon is basically a superstructure, which by the end of the third act, it was very clear that it was. And again, you have another typical trope. I've seen this done in 2012. And so it got a little bit distracting with all the tropes that you've seen from all the different disaster movies in the past. And that's all part of that buildup. I wish the buildup was done completely different. Like I said, I hated the first half of this movie. And so as the story progresses and we start to go into the third act. The moon is basically getting closer and closer to the Earth. Gravity is being affected. The disaster, essentially, portion of the movie is truly starting to shine. You're starting to see, your typical landmarks get destroyed because the moon's getting closer. So you're going to have the ocean waves come in and, all of the coastal cities get destroyed from New York to San Francisco, another typical trope in disaster movies. I'm okay with that because, again, I like destruction. But it had me questioning things from time to time. And just from a logical perspective, this movie is not logical by any stretch of the imagination. It's not realistic by any stretch of the imagination. But it's the third act that really shined as a sci-fi movie. And so again, some major spoilers here. So basically, they discovered that the alien, or it's not alien, it is a nanotechnology that has basically become self-aware. And they figured out that if you have, and this is the part that was confusing about it too, is like this nanotechnology AI, I gotta say AI because that's what it was. Nanotech AI would attack any organic life form that's encapsulated into some sort of technological sphere, the best way I can describe it. And so it was discovered that they need to use an old space shuttle, aka the Endeavour, to go up and go into the moon. Now, there was a whole bunch of, again, realism goes out the window with this movie. They basically, in about the time, again, pacing was also bad too. In the time of like an hour, they were able to get the Endeavour out of the museum that's in California, be able to strap a booster and side rockets onto it, and get it upright with the payload so they can go into the moon's surface to try to detonate an EMP. And they launch it from Vandenberg Space Force Base. There is so much wrong in that one sentence, I cannot even begin to describe how bad it was. Again, logic went out the window. And my head was shaking the whole freaking time. It's like, I understand disaster movies. I want a little bit more realism than trying to do all of these little things. It's like, can you imagine trying to do that now? It would take years to do that. And this movie says, oh, we're going to do it in about a day's time frame. Ridiculous, to say the least. I was rolling my eyes. I was laughing so hard because the first and second acts was so freaking bad. So bad. But anyways, our three main heroes then go up into space with the Endeavour and the EMP payload. And so they're able to go through the moon because there's like this little hole that goes through the moon. And they basically take the lander, and I'm summarizing a lot, okay, because I don't want to go into every single detail. But they basically go through the Earth, or not the Earth, excuse me, the moon, and they take the payload with them. And then there's basically the nanotech AI that then kind of detects them. But then just when they think all hope is lost, someone is helping them. And then you quickly discover that, there's a white dwarf inside of the moon. And you got basically this giant superstructure of rings. The CGI was amazing. Like, that's when we started to get into the beginning of the third act, this movie takes a complete 180 from a disaster movie. As they start flying through, and I kind of spotted this in my trailer review saying that, wait a minute, we're going to get aliens in this. Well, there's a lot more to talk about with that. And so they are basically drug in by some sort of tractor beam, and also the tech that's in there was able to pilot the ship, or this capsule, into a landing bay of this alien technology. And so our main astronaut, Brian Harper, then basically gets captured, quote unquote captured. And then the operating system of the so-called superstructure basically tells him a story of the entire superstructure that is the moon. And this is where the sci-fi story bloomed. because they basically give us a huge lore exposition dump on us. And what happened was is that the human ancestors came from a planet that was technologically advanced. You basically had a golden era of this human race, and they developed technology, aka artificial intelligence, through nanotechnology to basically do all of the lesser work of humanity. And then, unfortunately, the nanotechnology became self aware, became AI, and then basically rebelled against the human race, or quote unquote human race. I don't know, they really weren't clear on what race they really were, but they're obviously humanoid humans essentially. And so this nanotechnology basically rebelled and started a war against the humans. Now this storyline it was really cool to see, and that's the story that I want in a Netflix series, because the story that they gave us was basically the Matrix in a way, slash a hint of Terminator in a way, but it felt new, it felt fresh, it felt different. And it was so unfortunate because since this was a 2-hour movie, they can only lore dump on us for about 5 to 10 minutes. And the graphics were so cool. I mean, you had rings around this high significant planet, and it reminded me of Halo even, a modern day Halo movie, and it was just amazing to see. And so these rings were basically the Ark. They were able to encapsulate other dwarf or what was it? White dwarfs to get energy sources, and then they built these shells. And unfortunately, these nanobots was able to, or these nano AI was able to hunt down and destroy some of the last remnants of this human species. And with the exception of one, the sphere was able to find a area before the Big Bang happened. Once the Big Bang happened, they were able to move this moon-sized sphere thing into orbit of the Earth when it was still being formed from the Big Bang. And then obviously it took years upon years upon years to develop the Earth. And then they inserted their DNA into the ecosystem, so that way it eventually went through the process of evolution to bring up the human race. If you're religious, you're probably going to hate this movie because, there's a lot of issues with that I'm not even going to touch. So this is the storyland storytelling. So don't get mad. I mean, this is how the story was being told, and so, but I do like that story a lot. And so it was very clear that we basically got to the answer to in this story world of how the humans came about. And it was a great little story. That lore dump was like, that's the good story. That's the story I wish I could see, because we really haven't seen anything sci-fi-ish to that point. And so our astronaut, Brian Harper, he gets all of this lore dump, and then they go out to their pod, and it's all repaired, and they basically have this plan to try to detonate the EMP against the nanobots AI that was rising up. And what's cool about it is that, again, the CGI was amazing. The ships look unique. There was VTOL aircraft. There was starships in this superstructure. And it just felt so cool to see something so different and so new. And it's like, it was true sci-fi at its finest. Like, it gave me Halo vibes. It was so good. And they continued to fly around, and the operating system of the superstructure was trying to assist with them. And then they had to make a very hard decision to figure out who was going to detonate the EMP, because you basically had this pod that attached to it was a moon rover, essentially, that had the EMP in there. And so, unfortunately, one of them has to detonate the EMP. I'm not going to say who, because again, I kind of want you guys to experience that moment if you still want to watch this movie, if I haven't spoiled it enough for you already. And so the EMP is detonated, the nanotech technology was defeated, and the moon goes back into orbit. And the day is saved. Man, that third act really, it really just blossomed a potential sci-fi story. It is a shame this movie was mismarketed and even misbranded. In my perfect world of this particular story, I would cut out completely the first and second half of the story and really give the show the breathing room that it needs. This movie should have been a TV show. If it would have been a TV show, it would have given like entire season to do so much more to build up to that moment of what the moon really is. And it would have given the time for the human technology at the time to kind of explore what's going on the surface of the moon. Because this was crammed into a 2-hour show or 2-hour movie, there was no way you were going to be able to get the buildup that you needed to get into the third act of this movie. It was really mismarketed. Like I said, my ideal circumstance for this movie is that it would have been, I would have rebranded this and I would have called it Nano. That is the type of show I would have called this. Nano, a sci-fi story. And put it on Netflix. Because that third act was so good. But because of the poor buildup, because of these rush characters, there's way too much of the human element storytelling that really just bogged down that third act. Because they needed to do something in order to really get to that point in time. But yeah, they focused way too much on, there was a lot of like family problems that came from the aftermath of that quote unquote cover up that came from NASA and the government. And so you also follow the families a little bit, the ex-wives and kids and so forth. And they focus on that way too much. Way too much, because it got to a point by the end of the story, I didn't care about any of them. You know, I only cared about our three main characters in this movie. So because of that, this was, oh man, it was bad. You can tell that there's a good sci-fi story that wants to be told in this. Unfortunately, the first and second act just kill it outright. And by the end of it, the ending shot of it was just gorgeous. It was really gorgeous just to see. It's like that's a good sci-fi story to tell. But again, it just gets drowned out by the first and second acts. And yeah, there's definitely no logic. There's no just rational thought on how to execute these missions. I got a chuckle because there's a few SpaceX references in there. Because again, I'm a geek about space, and I chuckled a little bit when there was a few SpaceX things involved in this movie. But yeah, so in conclusion, I'm going to give this like a 3 out of 10, and that is definitely, or let me rephrase, 3 ice cubes, because I like to use my ice cube rating out of 10. And like I said, the first and second act was just abysmal to get through. I didn't care too much about the human aspects of this movie. You know, I was expecting a disaster movie out of this, and so it's like, usually by the end of the first act into the second act, the disaster's striking. And it kind of does, but it's convoluted. It's really convoluted between trying to balance out all of the characters that they're trying to present to you, trying to show the human issues that are going on behind the scenes. It was just too much. It was really drowned out. But yeah, overall, the CGI was really good. Again, there was some great disaster moments in this, but the ending really made it to where this was horribly created for the wrong medium. For 2 hours, just not enough time to tell the story. 2, mismarketed. It should have never been called Moonfall. It should have been called Nano, in my humble opinion. I think that would have been a great story to tell. And it should have been a sci-fi story on Netflix. Had it given the proper episodic creation, I think we could have got some great backstory, especially in that third act. And we could have fallen in love, I think, more with the characters. They were trying to do too much with too little time. But yeah, like I said, I would not recommend watching it in theaters. This is a movie that should be watched from a rent box or a streaming service, and just try to get to that third act. Try to get to that third act, and you'll see what I mean by, man, this is all of a sudden a great sci-fi. But yeah, with that, guys, that's pretty much all I got. Thank you guys so much for listening to this review on Moonfall. And with that, wing hugs to all, and to all a good night.